Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bonnie Glaser, and I'm the director of the China Power Project and senior advisor for Asia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Very pleased you could come this afternoon despite the wonderful weather outside. But we hope that you will enjoy and benefit from the conversation that we're going to have today. First, among ourselves as a group of experts, and then bringing you, the audience, into the discussion. The annual U.S.-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue just provides us with a great opportunity to take stock of the U.S.-China relationship, and that's what we're going to do today. And I'm just going to briefly introduce our moderator, Susie Jakes, who is going to introduce later on the rest of the panel. Susie is the editor of ChinaFile and a senior fellow at the Asia Society Center for U.S.-China Relations. So I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. So first of all, I want to thank Bonnie and the team at CSIS for organizing this discussion, to which we're all greatly looking forward. And as Bonnie said, I'm going to start by briefly framing our topic and then introduce the four very distinguished women sitting around me. We're going to focus today on two closely interrelated topics. The first, as Bonnie just mentioned, is the upcoming U.S.-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue, which is to be held early next month in Beijing. And the second is what the relationship between the two countries looks like right now across the range of fields in which our panelists are experts. This will be the 8th round of the S&ED, as the Strategic and Economic Dialogue is commonly known. The meetings have been held annually in alternating capitals. They were established in 2009 to expand on a framework that had been established by Presidents George W. Bush and Hu Jintao in 2007. And the idea for the meetings was that working on separate tracks, an economic track and a strategic track, you could consolidate a whole ever-expanding list of bilateral interactions among the various agencies of our respective governments, elevate these interactions through the involvement of the chairs of the dialogue, the Secretary of the Treasury and the Secretary of State on the US side, and their high-level counterparts, this year Vice Premier Wang Yang and State Councilor Yang Jiechi on the Chinese side, as well as through the involvement of cabinet-level officials on both sides. And that through this consolidation and elevation, you would create a higher level of attention to major issues between the two countries in a way that would facilitate progress and get you sort of more diplomatic bang for your buck. So that, I think it's fair to say, was and is the working theory of the meetings. Of course, they exist within an ecosystem of many other formats of multilateral and bilateral interaction between the two countries: state visits, participation in APEC, the G20, the Nuclear Security Summit, newly formed groups to address terrorism, separate dialogues on the rule of law, human rights, regional security, public health, climate, meetings that fall under the rubric of what the Chinese like to call people-to-people exchange, et cetera. But if these are kind of the niche boutique forms of diplomacy, then the S&ED is like Target, or Bloomingdale's if you prefer. It's got a little bit of everything. And this year alone, the list of issues to be discussed includes conflicts in the Middle East, Hong Kong, Taiwan, law enforcement, the South China Sea, bilateral investment, maritime conservation, climate change, counterterrorism, trade in IED precursors, North Korea, even outer space. And 8 years in, the S&ED has become a central part of the architecture, or what my colleague Orville Schell sometimes likes to call the diplomatic musculature, that binds the two countries together, and which theoretically at least helps to make a complex relationship more predictable, more orderly, and more flexible, to create what officials involved in the process often call the habits of cooperation. It's still young, but it's already become an institution, one with its own rhythms and rituals. Some of you may even have a pair of the Kurt Campbell Memorial S&ED cufflinks. I don't. So what we're going to do is we'll discuss its achievements in greater detail in a few minutes. But I think one moment that was illustrative of the dialogue's resilience and the import that both countries attached to it, or at least attached to it, came 4 years ago in 2012, when in the middle of the meetings in Beijing, the blind activist, lawyer, and prominent face of dissidents in China, Chen Guangcheng, showed up at the US Embassy asking for protection right in the middle of the meetings. Needless to say, this was potentially a hugely destabilizing moment in relations between the two countries. But despite this, and despite, or maybe thanks to some nail-biting nights on both sides, the dialogue went on relatively unscathed. So part of what we're here today to do is to try to assess to what extent the S&ED as a mechanism for interaction is working, and where and how, if it's an institution that ought to be preserved by a future administration, whether and how and where it might be improved, or if there are better alternatives. But we also want to look at what's on the agenda for this year, and at a time when I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say the relationship between the US and China faces elevated levels of tension, unprecedented over the past decade across a number of different key touch points, what this year's meeting ought to achieve and what it has the potential to achieve. So with that, I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to invite each one of them to give you a brief briefing on their respective area. And we'll then continue the conversation collectively, and around 2:30 or so, I'll open the floor to your questions. So we'll begin with our host, who needs no introduction but has already introduced herself. I will just say that Bonnie has been at CSIS for many years, and she's worked with great and justified distinction on a whole range of regional and global issues related to Chinese foreign policy and security policy. And I think I speak for many people in the media when I say she's one of the most dependently cogent, informative voices we can turn to when we're trying to make sense of what's happening in Asia diplomatically and militarily. Sophie Richardson, to her right, is China Director at Human Rights Watch and a specialist on human rights issues across Asia. She is, as many of you know, a tireless advocate for attention to rights issues in the bilateral relationship. Welcome, Sophie. Erin Ennis, to my left, has been at the US-China Business Council since 2005, and she's now its vice president, and has been, I guess, for the last year. And prior to joining the US-China Business Council, she worked at Kissinger McLarty Associates. And then to my far left, Joanna Lewis is associate professor of science, technology, and international affairs at Georgetown's Edmund Walsh School of Public Policy. And both there and in a number of other posts too numerous to list, her research focuses on energy, environment, and innovation in China, including renewable energy industry development and climate change policy. So I think I'm going to start with Erin to give us a sense of what's in the economic basket for this year's dialogue and where you see opportunities for agreement. And I just want to add a little twist to that. I was here on Monday for the launch of CSIS's terrific new report on the 13th five-year plan. And in introducing it, Bonnie's colleague, Chris Johnson, pointed out that generally speaking, the E side of the S&ED equation has involved much smoother sailing than the strategic side. For a number of obvious reasons, but that this year might be the first year when, as he put it, the economic relationship may be becoming more tense than the security relationship. So maybe you can include whether you concur.
It's a challenge. Thank you for the kind introduction. Maybe I will start with that comment. I guess I would say that as with many things when you are dealing with economic issues with two major countries, it all depends on a variety of factors. I think you'll probably see that from everybody's comments today. Certainly in the economic sphere, really what American companies are facing in China really depends on their sector. Companies that are in technology have a very different circumstance that they're dealing with than those that are dealing with consumer goods, or those that might be competing with Chinese products that might have concerns about product safety. And that has an impact then on how you view the market as a whole. So certainly there is concern, I think a lot of concern in the American business community about the direction of China's economic reforms and whether those reforms are going to lead to more genuine opening for foreign companies, or if they are going to maintain the status quo and close off areas where companies thought in the future they would potentially have more potential. So with that as the context, let me kind of give a brief overview of what we think could and should happen at this year's S&ED. I think probably first and foremost, I do think that's important to have one of the components of this year's S&ED be a review of what has been accomplished at past S&EDs. We are in a transition year here in the United States. We're going to have a new administration. No matter who it is going to probably be doing an across-the-board evaluation about what works and what doesn't work. The S&ED has been going on for 8 years. Its precursor, the SED, went on for, I believe, 2 before the end of the Bush administration. If you're not finding value in the structure, you either need to reconsider what it is and whether it's working, but you need to do that based on what the facts are. I do think there has been some value out of the S&ED. We certainly have seen some issues move forward, not solely because of the S&ED, but because of the continuum of engagement that happens throughout the year on economic issues. There's the S&ED. There have been, at least to date, at least one annual meeting of the 2 presidents of the country. There's the Joint Committee on Commerce and Trade. That provides a nice cycle where you can tee up an issue, make some progress on it, and then use the next opportunity to continue to move those issues forward. So I think that that is going to be necessary to show value to whomever the next president and their administration would be. On the key issues for the business community going into the S&ED, there are evergreen issues that we would insist be raised no matter what else is going on. Intellectual property rights protection is a consistent area that is ever evolving and always worthwhile to discuss. Transparency issues, really the basic issues of not just releasing laws and regulations for public comment before they go into place, but making sure that a company, when they've applied for a license, can get good information about where their license is in the process, making sure that those systems are functioning so that you get a license approved in the right amount of time. Those are all key issues that you can really only discuss in a large forum like this because it hits at so many of the individual sectors that companies are in. For specific issues this year, I would say what we hope would be at the top of the list is investment issues. And I say that as a very broad category, but it hits on a lot of individual issues within it. Number one would be we would love to see something come out as progress on the bilateral investment treaty. We were anticipating China tabling its next offer in March. It didn't come. We are ever hopeful that that is going to mean that this is the next big opportunity for them to table something, and that what China tables will be meaningful and have new access for sectors that have been closed off since prior to China's joining the WTO, but that have remained closed since then. It is a bilateral investment treaty is still our best option as a business community to have a way at getting at a wide variety of areas that impact how foreign companies and domestic companies in China compete, and to provide the opportunity for a level playing field. I think related to that, though, is if the BIT is not going to move forward, we do need to see some progress on other investment openings in China. China's economic reforms since the beginning have laid out this idea that the market would become more open, and senior leaders have said that they have every intention of ensuring that foreign companies are able to compete more in the market. There's no reason why that has to wait. It's not necessary to wait for an investment treaty to get that done. If it's in China's economic interest to do it, why not do it now? That would certainly build some confidence in the relationship, which is certainly for certain sectors going through some very significant concerns about the direction of reforms and how foreign companies are going to be treated. But I think that that would be something that would be a highlight if it were to come to pass. Related to those, though, I think are some of the more challenging issues that we'll have to see where progress can be made. China has been using in recent years more and more frequently the the labeling of something being a national security issue to advance investment issues. And while there are certainly in every government's right to protect their national security, using that as a means to constrict trade not only is a problem in terms of what a country's WTO commitments are, but it frankly runs counter to what your economic development goals are, because it means that you aren't allowing in the best technology, more competition, the kinds of things that make economies dynamic and continuing to grow. We have seen that pop up most recently and most frequently in regulations that cite the need for the use of secure and controllable technology. While that definition has never been put out, in practice, it appears that secure and controllable means produced by a domestically owned Chinese company. That is counter to what you might want for security of information networks, but frankly, it also, again, gets back to those competition issues. We've also, though, seen it have an impact not only in how American technology companies might have access to the market, but also in terms of some really basic business functions, cross-border data flows. When you are a credit card company, the ability to check whether a transaction is legitimate in one market against what might be going on in another is essential to ensuring both the protection of your client's information, but also the integrity of your network. There's also been policies come up on online publishing and all that seem to point to a direction that foreign technology companies in particular are going to have a hard time of it in the future, and unclear direction about whether they will be welcome to participate fully in the market. Let me just kind of wrap up the other issues that I think are important, and perhaps if of interest we can go into further detail, but I do think that overcapacity issues are ones that we expect and hope will have a good discussion at this year's S&ED. It's impacting not just what's going on in the steel and concrete markets, but it too is impeding some of the economic reforms that China is seeking. We recognize that those issues are tied up a lot into employment issues in China. What do you do with 3 million workers who had been working in steel or coal mining or those kinds of areas? But those are essential for China's economy to transform itself into a fully 21st century economy. There's an ongoing negotiation on the environmental goods agreement that we view as very much a priority, and we hope some progress can be made on that. Outstanding approvals of American biotech products, and certainly the overarching issues of national treatment. So with that riverfront, I'll turn it back.
Okay. I'm going to ask just one follow-up question, which is how the structure of the S&ED kind of works for these issues to do with opening of markets and market access. Because it seems like, it doesn't seem like it, it is the case that we are asking China to do much more opening of their markets than they are asking. I mean, our markets are essentially open to their investment. Yeah. But in any negotiation, you need to have sort of a level of parity in terms of gives or gets. So are there things that we ought to be giving them to get what we want, or is that the wrong way to think about it? Is this just more of an opportunity for us to sort of communicate our concerns, or can there really be a kind of give and take type of negotiation on these kinds of issues?
I think that the personality, if an entity can have a personality, I think the personality of the S&ED actually is one where not only should it not be, but I don't think that it functions well if it's a quid pro quo. We have fundamental differences in our economy. The United States economy is much more open, and if this becomes a discussion in any way of we'll only open up an area if you open up whatever the remaining areas are, I don't think that is helpful generally to the economic relationship, but it certainly doesn't help address any of the broader goals that the S&ED was set up to deal with on the economic side, and that was looking at how China's economy wants to transform, where it wants to go, and what the steps are that are necessary to go in that. The economic side of this discussion covers everything from the exchange rate, not just in what China's renminbi is valued against the US dollar, but how does a well-functioning monetary policy function? What does it look like when you have concerns about capital outflows? I mean, it is the basis of a very collaborative discussion of sharing US experiences and talking through what might work better for China's economy and helping it to achieve its goals. But you can't miss an opportunity in a bilateral discussion to hopefully make progress on the issues that underlie that as well.
All right, I'm going to turn now to Bonnie, who has the more traditionally tension-filled basket, and I think again it wouldn't be controversial to to say that we could spend this entire panel discussing the issues in your sphere. But I thought maybe you could just highlight for us, where the focus will be, where it ought to be in this round, what's achievable, what can be teed up for President Xi and Obama's meetings in September during the G20, and if possible, how you see the security relationship interacting with the economic relationship, if at all.
Well, let me start by saying that before the S&ED opens, there will be a round of the SSD, the Strategic Security Dialogue, and that was actually created it was the brainchild of Jim Steinberg, and it brings together civilian and military officials to talk about nuclear policy and missile defense and cyber issues, maritime issues, and North Korea is often on that agenda as well. And this has been held usually twice a year, and it was supposed to, intersessional was supposed to be held in January. It actually didn't happen until a few weeks ago. But that shows you how the S&ED and the associated meetings with it do force both sides to sit down and talk about some issues, because then annually at this S&ED, they produce this long list of outcomes. And so in the strategic track, last year, there were, I think, 127 outcomes. So this is an accumulation of what's been done over the year. Obviously, they weren't all decided at the S&ED itself. And as Joanna will talk about, a lot of them have to do with climate change and environment issues. But there's always a few that do address some of these other issues as well. So outer space is one of those issues in the SSD, and there was just a round following up on the commitment last year. They established this mechanism to talk about outer space. And one of the things, for example, in that dialogue is an effort to try and create a confidence building measure where both sides will not create large debris fields such as was created in 2007 when China conducted that anti-satellite test. And China would like to expand bilateral cooperation in space. So this is one promising area. In the strategic track of the S&ED this time, there will be essentially three baskets. So one is going to be issues in the Asia-Pacific region. That's South China Sea, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute, and North Korea. Then there's a bilateral discussion that will focus on counterterrorism, law enforcement, Taiwan, which is not on the agenda officially, but always comes up in that context, Hong Kong, and then there's also discussion of human rights in that, which Sophie will talk about. And then there's a regional basket, which includes the Middle East, China's role in Syria in the counter-ISIL effort, which is evolving. China has joined a group of countries now in the finance aspect of counter-ISIL, not joining the entire counter-ISIL coalition, but cooperating in the financial area. And then Afghanistan, where there's been joint training of diplomats and some health education cooperation. And South Sudan has been a prominent issue and will be again. So I think I'll just say a little bit more about Korea and South China Sea. So North Korea, I see as one of those issues that can be a very positive one or a very negative one for the US-China relationship. And right now we are in a place where it is on the positive side of the ledger. Beijing supported UN Security Council 2270, for the first time does contain economic sanctions. The Chinese have passed their own domestic regulations, which have signaled their enterprises what they can import and export. We're only a little bit over 3 months out from the passage of 2270, and I think it's a bit premature to say whether there is full compliance. The rhetoric is strong. Xi Jinping has personally said that this is something they're going to stringently enforce. But there's some wiggle room in the language of the Security Council resolution for humanitarian purposes, or if money that is being earned by North Korea from selling coal and iron ore is not being used for the nuclear missile programs, then it's exempted. So I think that there are loopholes that unfortunately are a bit wide, but the real question is then, how is China's imports of coal and iron ore changing from the period before this UN Security Council resolution was passed? And so I think one of the things that the US should try to do, if it isn't already, is to actually try to get data from the Chinese. And they should be making this public. Are their imports decreasing? And China probably imports 95% of coal and iron ore from North Korea. So it's really critical that they comply. The track record, of course, of the Chinese in the past is that they start off with strong compliance and that over time become more lax. And if that happens this time around, I think that will be very problematic for the US-China relationship and would be something that would then be inherited here by the next president, and it would be cause a very bad start to the relationship. But I don't want to presume that it will go in a negative direction because we don't know. And then I'll say a little bit more about the South China Sea. And, of course, this, like North Korea, is something that the US and China have been talking about a lot. On lots of different venues and at various levels. The United States, I think, has been urging China to accept the tribunal in The Hague as legitimate and respect the ruling once it comes down, which is expected to be maybe June or July. And there has been no wavering of China's position. In fact, very much gone in the other direction. China is now engaged in this very active diplomacy, very much like the United States is rallying countries to its side. So I think what we're likely to see here is mostly a presentation of each side's positions in a very tough way. The United States at least hopes that after the ruling comes down, it won't be a trigger for another round of land reclamation, which we have seen reports about the possibility of more land reclamation on Scarborough Shoal, which is very close to the main island of the Philippines, and new US access points for our assets that we are rotating through there. Construction and what Xi Jinping has said, China has no intention to militarize the Spratlys, but I think the US continues to have those concerns. So I think the main US message is, and has been for some time, let's get this back on the diplomacy track. Let's have a serious conversation between China and ASEAN about a code of conduct. Let's talk about peaceful uses of the South China Sea. Deal with the fishing problems, because there's a lot of fishermen out there whose lives really depend on this. But I sense that the U.S. is not making headway on this. I doubt that there will be any breakthroughs this time around. This is an issue we're certainly not going to see resolution in the near term. I wouldn't be surprised if there's very little mention in the outcome statement, because there's not going to be much agreement. And so I think this is, it's an ongoing conversation. We need to manage the issue. And then just a couple of sentences about the other element of South China Sea, which is the close-in surveillance. And many of you may have read that just a couple of weeks ago, there was an unsafe intercept by 2 J-11 fighters of a US surveillance aircraft. We do now have a bilateral MOU that has an air-to-air encounters annex that is supposed to it lays out procedures about how these intercepts should be conducted safely. The US says China violated it, China says that it didn't, but in the strategic security dialogue, we will certainly see this addressed. I'm not sure that I see any great intersection between the economic and the security issues. In my view, these are pretty much on separate tracks. And I should emphasize that although I did talk mostly about South China Sea and North Korea, some of these other areas are seeing some important progress as well. And so it's a broader conversation, and it's become more and more global as China is willing to take on some responsibilities, such as for UN peacekeeping operations and provide funding to the UN, much more than they have in the past. As China steps up and as it wants to promote its interests globally, there are more potential opportunities for cooperation.
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to come back to you on why you think the negotiations on the South China Sea are not working so well. But first, I want to ask Sophie a question. So Sophie, this has been, I keep saying this over and over again, but again, it's not very controversial to say that this has been a year of pretty severe deterioration in a whole host of spheres of Chinese domestic life that are related to human rights, media, law, academia, and basically all of the sort of pillars of the way that we define human rights on the US side. But another interesting thing about this year, I think, is that in maybe a more pronounced way than in previous years, some of the issues that had seemed like domestic human rights issues are now kind of spreading into other parts of the bilateral relationship in ways that are potentially much more irritating to the relationship. And I'm thinking particularly about the law that was recently enacted on the management of foreign NGOs, which is not, doesn't just target organizations like Human Rights Watch, but also industry associations, major research universities, alumni groups, and all of these other kinds of institutions on the US side that have interactions with China that sort of go beyond the traditional parameters of what we consider to be human rights issues. So I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about that, and then what is on the agenda as far as you know for this year, and what ought to be on the agenda, which is what you want to talk
First
about.
of all, thank you very much for doing this. And thanks, Susie, for moderating. I do think that in the last couple of months, these two issues in particular, the adoption of the foreign NGO management law and the abduction of non-PRC passport holding citizens from Hong Kong and from Thailand, has really galvanized the discussion within the US government, but also within other governments that, issues that in the past American and other diplomats have at least been able to regard as a problem that happened there and to another government's people. There was a certain amount of distance. Now some of these things are coming home to roost. And when you look at the variety, the incredible diversity of organizations that weighed in the submission period about the foreign NGO management law, universities, groups, and communities across this stage and across this room, trade associations, all sorts of. When I got called by a high school marching band association based in Florida, wondering whether they should cancel their summer tour, I knew that we were really in very different territory. And the US has to respond to those concerns of its constituents. It really has taken a human rights issue that, and these are regulations that Chinese NGOs have had to live with always, essentially, and they've exported them. And I think they've introduced a degree of uncertainty and surveillance over and control over communities that not only have, I think, done fantastic work, but also served as incredibly important ballast in the bilateral relationship. That even when complicated security issues were going wrong or trade disputes were hot, that communications and joint programs between universities in some ways could sort of help ease some of those tensions, that foundations could fund environmental work, and that was considered to be a bond that helped in some ways soothe other parts of the relationship. And now that's at risk. And I think that's really alarmed US government officials and made them feel they have to be much more assertive and push back. This was one of the 2 or 3 human rights issues that came up in the meeting between President Obama and President Xi on the margins of the Nuclear Security Summit. I certainly hope that not only will there continue to be vigorous pushback against the law, but also that American diplomats will, Deputy Secretary Blinken said this very nicely at an SFRC hearing a couple of weeks ago, but there would also be an effort to push back against the carve-outs. Right? The law envisions the possibility of making life easier for the foreign NGOs or organizations that Beijing likes, while reserving the ability to restrict and impose pretty serious restrictions on the ones it doesn't.
But how do you do that? I mean, how do you do that when individual organizations right now are all sort of trying to find out how the law is going to be implemented, how it's going to affect them, and then essentially working their contacts in Beijing to try to get themselves exempt? I mean,
I think
if you're the State Department, how do you craft a powerful form of pushback when that
I think
thing's happening?
I think you have to be prepared to say, you can't just let in the ones you like. You can't only accept, the high-profile Ivy League cooperation programs and not accept, for example, funding from the U.S. to civil society groups in China that do really edgy work on human rights issues and legal reform. I think the U.S. has to say these are of a piece, and if you move to restrict the ones you don't like and only let in the other ones, we have to find a way of responding to that. Now, we could have a long conversation about what the appropriate responses are and what is constructive in the long runs. Let me be very clear, we're very pro-exchange, going in both directions. But I think the U.S. is really going to have to fight for the full scope of cooperation. But just to come back to the issue about the case that's sort of come to be known by the shorthand of the Hong Kong booksellers, I think a number of governments have suddenly sat up and said, that could happen to our citizens, right? That these are realities, that it took place alongside a case of a Swedish person who'd been working for a domestic human rights organization, I think painted a picture to a number of the like-minded governments that are engaged on human rights issues, that work that was being done by foreign NGOs in the mainland or activists in the mainland, or even people who had irked Beijing but were standing outside its territory, are suddenly, at least in Beijing's view or in some officials' view, legitimate targets for essentially enforced disappearances. I think that triggered a real wave of alarm and to a large extent contributed to a coordinated pushback of the Human Rights Council in March. It was a statement signed by a dozen governments of a kind that we hadn't seen since 2004. It had been 12 years since there had been a joint statement in that forum. And I think that was mostly an expression of concern and saying, this is a line that can't be crossed. I think the S&ED has never offered a natural home for human rights issues. One way of understanding this may be that if you look across those outcomes documents, I pulled them all up last week and looked at all of them, it's essentially the same bullet point, one out of like 120 on human rights issues, before Guangcheng, during Guangcheng, after Guangcheng, right? I mean, it's an issue that's generally relegated to the bilateral issues discussion. It's sharing time with a number of other issues, all of them important. It's relatively infrequent that the senior-most diplomat from the State Department who works on human rights issues even participates in that conversation. And to the extent that there was a tactical effort by the first Obama administration that we'd been optimistic about, but that I think really hasn't panned out, was the idea that the US should take a whole-of-government approach to human rights issues. And I think it matters because the Chinese political context is one that I think values consistency and hearing the same message from many different kinds of messengers. And in that sense, having people across the S&ED raise human rights issues, whether it's people in the Department of Justice or DHS talking about whether the Chinese police they envision cooperating with on law enforcement have been implicated in ill treatment or torture of suspects. We could spend a long time talking about the different permutations that could be parceled out across all of the different agencies that participate in the S&ED. And that's never really quite come to pass. There have certainly been more coordinated discussions within the administration over the years. If there could be a happy surprise on the how of human rights diplomacy at this S&ED, it would be to see more of what what agencies other than the State Department have pressed for, in human rights terms, not just their own sort of particular interests. So.
That's a very complete answer. All right, I'm going to turn fully around to Joanna, who actually, I assume as a climate change expert, it's really rare that you're the one on a panel telling the happy story, but in the context of U.S.-China relationship.
I play this role a lot.
You are working in the area where there really has been, particularly over the last year, some very exciting cooperation between our two countries. And so I thought maybe you could just talk a little bit about what the next steps are since Paris, and to what extent there are sort of mechanisms within the S&ED that advance implementation of that agreement, and then what else you think we should be paying attention to in this field.
Sure. I mean, I think the energy and climate space has been a really interesting one to see evolve over the last 8 years or so in terms of the U.S.-China bilateral relationship, because it's really been, as you mentioned, sort of the bright spot of the bilateral relationship, and that wasn't always the case. I think now, more than before, you actually see the two countries' domestic priorities very much aligned in terms of where countries want to go, in terms of reducing emissions, in terms of low carbon transition, and that does make for a more constructive dialogue. I think that there's going to be some interesting areas to look for in this final round of the S&ED and the Obama administration. Of course, coming out of Paris, which I think both countries saw as a success from their perspectives in terms of reaching a global agreement. I think you're going to see a real focus both on what China and the U.S. can do to enhance their bilateral cooperation on energy and climate, and then sort of taking the Paris model and expanding from there how the bilateral relationship between the two countries can be used to expand constructive multilateral engagement on issues in climate and energy, with Paris being, I think, a great example, right, where the bilateral relationship was able to kind of springboard a broader multilateral discussion. So I think starting with the bilateral space, I think there's going to, as you mentioned, really be a focus on implementing the NDCs, as we call them, the commitments that China and the U.S. had put forward leading into the Paris meeting. So both countries have targets on the table. The attention now is really, are those targets going to be met? What's being done at the domestic level to make sure progress is being made? And so to that end, back in 2013, the Climate Change Working Group was launched under the S&ED framework by Secretary Kerry, and this really allows for a lot of pretty technical cooperation. There's multiple technical tracks that focus on a lot of the high-emitting energy sectors, so everything from industrial boilers to power sector, and I think you're going to see expanded and enhanced cooperation in all of these areas. So while you'll have sort of the high-level meetings going on in Beijing, on the sidelines you're actually going to have a lot of convening of technical experts at the working level to really hash out some of these more detailed issues surrounding efficiency standards of various technologies. You're going to see more work on power sector reform and the marketization that we're seeing in China. I mean, I think this is a really interesting area to watch evolving domestically in China. As you may know, China has had really amazing success expanding its renewable energy sector, and we actually see coal demand slowing in China, but there's real challenges, sort of growing pains within the power sector related to integrating renewables in the grid. There's going to be a cap and trade program launched next year, and so there's a lot of discussion happening now domestically about how you make a more efficient power sector and how that will actually better incentivize low carbon technology. And I think another interesting thing to look for will be a focus on high potency greenhouse gas emissions. So there's been increasing focus on the sort of non-CO2 greenhouse gases that can get you some quick reductions. And then also on the implementation side, something that was launched last year was the Cities Summit, which took place in Los Angeles. They're going to have the second meeting of that in Beijing during the S&ED. And again, this is really about implementation of the climate targets. So you're going to see many US mayors traveling there, meeting with Chinese mayors, because of course it's really at the city and state level here and in China where you have a lot of these, the high level targets are now being passed down. So whether we're looking at Clean Power Plan in the United States or you're looking at sort of similar domestic, provincial and local level policies starting to change local environments, I think that's really going to be a big focus of that summit as well. And then, so the other area I think is this multilateral piece. And so I think this is something that the US government would like to in many ways take the success of how I think a constructive bilateral relationship with China, the two largest emitters, on climate, was able to, I think, in many ways be a core mobilizer of a broader international agreement. I think there's a few other areas where you could see that kind of constructive relationship spill over multilaterally, so in the environmental area particularly. So one of those would be, for example, the Montreal Protocol, where they're trying to get an agreement on HFCs, which are also a potent greenhouse gas. ICAO, which is where you're looking at aviation emissions, which isn't currently covered by Paris. The Arctic Council, the G20 and APEC coming up later this year, as was mentioned, where I think you're going to see climate and energy sort of high-level announcements there as well. And then the Clean Energy Ministerial, which has been an ongoing effort that actually China is going to has offered to host next year. It's in California this year, will be in China next year. So I think that's another one that will be interesting to look for, sort of how their leadership spills into that forum. And I think, finally, the area where there, I think, is real need for more concrete discussion, where the bilateral discussion is really just beginning, is in the role that both China and the United States play in, I guess I would say, greening global investment that both countries are doing around the world, right? So it's one thing if both countries are committing to reduce emissions in their own countries, but if you're building coal plants in other countries, and you are, of course, we see China playing an increasingly important role in global development financing, particularly in the developing world. You saw, China make very substantial commitments to South-South climate cooperation. You also see, of course, the emergence of AIIB and these other institutions, and I think there's a lot of interest in how that money will be spent and sort of, what will be the overall carbon and environmental implications of this type of financing. So I think that's going to be an area of debate, certainly, and it's of course maybe one of the more contentious areas sort of within this broader portfolio, but I think a really important one to have a concrete bilateral conversation continue.
So I want to give you all time to ask questions, but I thought I would just try to circle back to my original question with each of you. You began to answer it a little bit, Joanna, but I mean, I'm struck by listening to the four of you in some ways how separate each of your areas is from the others. Obviously there is overlap when you start talking about something like greening investment. But Sophie, you made the point about trying to sort of spread the human rights message over a whole bunch of meetings that are happening at the same time as a way of amplifying it. But are there other ways in which you feel like the specific format of the S&ED has been either beneficial or not so beneficial in each of your areas? I mean, is this a format that we should be attached to? Does it matter that all these meetings are happening at the same time? Is it sort of fulfilling its promise of elevating the efficacy of our diplomacy? You want to start? Erin?
I'll give it a shot. I think probably the biggest concern that I have is bandwidth. I mean, it's not just the fact that there's a cities conference, there's the S&ED, the SSD, there's discussions that are going on aviation. I mean, all of this is going on in one place. And it on paper looks great. The idea that you could theoretically have everybody in one place to talk about all of these cross-cutting issues and then be able to do deep dives into the ones that don't overlap. But it takes an incredible amount of manpower to do that. And just in trying to engage and get an agenda set, the right people at the table, agreement on what's going to be in an outcomes document, the concept is good, and the execution, I think, sometimes can be challenging, particularly as we have morphed. Last year, I believe, was the first year that the S&ED and the people-to-people conference happened at the same time. At a minimum, that means the Secretary Kerry has to be in two places at one time because it's two different interlocutors with two totally different agendas. And then I think the complexity is one that we need to think through what we're trying to achieve and whether we actually are getting more efficiency out of it by having everything at once, or if we actually are just making it so that we can't have a real conversation about some of those issues.
I'd like to raise a concern that I have, which is, I agree with what Erin said, but my concern is more about the individuals, particularly on the Chinese side. So we are now dealing with Wang Yang on the economic side and Yang Jiechi on the strategic track, both of whom do not have as close a relationship, we believe, to Xi Jinping than their predecessors had to Hu Jintao. And I think that there was a great deal of evidence when Hu Jintao was in charge in China that he was well prepped so that there would be these more organic connections between the S&ED and then teeing up the summit agenda, trying to actually get things done. And of course, Xi Jinping, with more of this kitchen cabinet type decision-making style, where he has put himself in charge of so many issues and has a small number of advisors and is not using the bureaucracy in the same way. The S&ED is rooted in the bureaucracies on both sides. This doesn't mean we can't get things done, and there are many examples that I've cited and others have cited. But I think particularly on these very sensitive issues like South China Sea, I really question whether the discussions that are taking place in the strategic track are necessarily reflecting what's in the minds of Xi Jinping. There's also some examples that come to mind where we've seen some discrepancies between the way some of these issues are dealt with. So, for example, the way that Yang Jiechi talks about Taiwan at certain junctures in an S&ED strategic track context has been very different than the way apparently Xi Jinping talks about them when he meets with President Obama. And so to me, these connections are not clear in every issue. Now, when all you need is the institutions, the interests are clearly converging, and then you can move forward and accomplish things, then it matters less. But on these other much more complicated issues, I think that the relationship between the people at the heads of the Chinese sides and strategic and economic track and their relationships to the top leader really matter. And so going forward, this is something that's beyond our control, but I think we at least have to recognize that it might be a problem.
I mean, can I ask a follow-up question? Bonnie, to what extent, though, do you think that on the U.S. side that might be an issue, too? I mean, certainly having Hank Paulson or Tim Geithner or Hillary Clinton at the head, where China was like the number one issue for them, can be a very different dynamic. The one that comes to mind for me is the innovation dialogue right now has been a good forum to talk about some of the challenging issues in China's innovation policies, but that does seem to be based very significantly on the personal relationship that John Holdren has with his counterpart at the Ministry of Science and Technology.
That's a very good point.
I was going to just say, do we have such a different kind of leader in Xi Jinping than his predecessors? He's sort of, how did Jeremy Barmay put it, the COE, chairman of everything? Mm-hmm. I mean, do we need to, is there some way, you said we can't do anything about this, but I mean, is there some way in which we ought to be readjusting our emphasis in terms of the mechanisms of bilateral interaction to sort of reflect this changed reality about how the leader interacts with his bureaucracy?
There's nothing that comes to mind in terms of specifics. I don't think that we should completely dispense with this process. I think it has proven that it makes some results. The question is whether we want to do so much at one time, as Erin said, or whether we want to utilize specific channels in ways that we can try to make sure we are getting to Xi Jinping. I mean, I think we have to try to think that through and maximize the communications that we're having. But ultimately, I think this is, it's bound to come up in a new administration. Do we change it? Obviously, this administration wanted to change it. They kicked it up to a higher level. We can't kick it up to any higher level. This is it. We're not going to have our two presidents conduct the S&ED. So it's mostly a question of what issues we're talking about, how many meetings we're having, who heads them, and then what that feedback mechanism is to leaders on both sides.
Do you want the final word before questions?
I just wanted to sort of take Erin's point and flip it around a little bit. I mean, at the risk of making it an all things to all people exercise, I do think it, along with presidential level meetings is sort of the flagship interaction, right? It's sort of the biggest of the stages. And in that sense, for example, I think that adding a clear human rights component to the S&ED would help considerably in making the bilateral human rights dialogue, which is held at a much lower level, sometimes doesn't happen at all. I mean, it's a very problematic mechanism. But adding a component at the S&ED might give it the political importance, at least from the US's side, to make the deeper dive conversation that could take place between sort of the technicians, so to speak, much more useful. The US has tried once or twice to float that idea of adding a human rights component, and the Chinese side has not gone for it. But I think as a reflection of the US's priorities, I think there's a little more room for maybe a few other letters in the acronym.
If I could just jump in with an example from the climate side, I mean, I think this is actually one area where having that high-level bilateral dialogue was extremely important. I mean, if you think back to 2009 and the Copenhagen Climate Summit, where you had the same administration from the U.S. in office, but you had a very different relationship bilaterally because you were really just sort of launching a set of bilateral discussions on the climate and energy issue, and so things were new. I think the trust was not quite there. I think the relationships were not as rich as they are now, and so I think in 2013 you had the launch of the Climate Change Working Group, which I mentioned, which was actually the first high-level bilateral mechanism we've had on climate specifically. I mean, we've done a lot on energy and sort of gotten at climate indirectly, but having that platform actually allowed for this back and forth at pretty high levels, sort of leading into Paris with the intention from both sides of actually avoiding a lot of the miscommunication that I think we saw from China and the U.S. in Copenhagen. And so, you actually had both the leaders of both countries agree, sort of heading into Paris, if either of us thinks, things are starting to go south, we will get each other on the phone, and that line is there, right? And I think that hadn't been done previously. And so, the S&ED is not the only mechanism for that type of conversation, and there's been these multiple summits. They've sort of found every opportunity to meet in the sidelines to talk about the climate issues specifically over the last couple of years. But I think that was under the umbrella of this working group that was launched under the S&ED. So I think that's one example where I think it shows that having that sort of engagement can, I think, be really constructive.
Okay, so now we're going to open up the floor for questions. If you could just wait until you receive a microphone and then stand and tell us who you are before you ask your question. That would be terrific. So maybe first this gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. My question is for Bonnie. You know what I want to ask. And you mentioned that the Taiwan was not on the agenda, but maybe coming up. But I'm wondering how will they talk about this issue, or how should they talk about this issue, particularly when considering this is the first time of the S&ED after Tsai Ing-wen's inauguration. And secondly, I'm just curious why today's panelists are all women. Thank you.
Maybe I could just answer that second question with a question back, which is, do you ever ask that question when the panel is all men? I think we can just we can thank Bonnie for that.
So in response to the question about Taiwan, my understanding is that Taiwan is never formally put on the agenda, but that it always comes up. Just as when Xi Jinping meets with President Obama, there is always some mention, usually by the Chinese side. And I think in the aftermath of Tsai Ing-wen's inauguration, which I personally think went quite well, and that she demonstrated a substantial goodwill in statements that she made, which should be viewed as very reassuring. But there's still some questions about whether there will be reliable and open communication channels, cooperation channels between the two sides of the strait, which have, of course, existed in the last 8 years under Ma Ying-jeou. So I think the main message of the Obama administration is going to be to encourage patience, restraint, continuing proactive efforts, not only by the mainland side, but also by Taiwan, although of course they're not at the table. I think that the US will convey that they're also telling Taipei to find ways to reach out, continue to show goodwill, reassurances, and to keep these channels of communication open, because there's so much interaction between Taiwan and mainland China in so many ways that the potential for miscalculation and simply problems if those channels really are shut down. But I certainly don't think this will be a centerpiece of the discussion on bilateral issues. As you can tell from what I said earlier, it's a very big agenda, but I think that's basically the way the conversation should go and will go, and I think that the United States is not eager to step into this issue and take charge. This is really between the two sides of the strait to work out, and the US will express its interest and perhaps make some suggestions.
Yes, right here in the front.
Thank you. I'm Irv Chapman. Reference has been made to American companies and industries whose attitude toward China depends on which sector they're in. Which American company or industries really happy campers about their ability to penetrate the Chinese market? And we're also in the midst of a political campaign in which China has been accused of spending 15 years stealing American jobs wholesale. Is there anything that Secretary Kerry or Secretary Liu can come back at the end of this and say, we did something to make it better?
I think that's mine.
That's for you,
Get the easy ones. So I think that every company that you would talk to that does business in China has some sort of a challenge, be it IP protection or whatever. But what companies are telling us in terms of what their financial returns are is that China is still growing faster than almost any other market in the world. And that as a consequence, the challenges of doing business in that market make it worthwhile, because if you're still getting 6-7% return on your investment in a market, whereas every place else in the world is only growing at 2 or 3%, it makes financial sense for your companies to be there and to figure out ways to work through the challenges that you've got. In terms of the jobs numbers, I think that this actually isn't a discussion about China as much as it's a discussion about how we think that trade has impacted our economy. We can have nuanced discussions about whether China was the one that caused job losses, whether it was automation, innovation, is it change in consumer preference. The fact is that the American economy is dynamic enough that we have been churning through industries for years. Manufacturing employment has been on the decline for 40 years at this point. Did it accelerate with China? We'd have to look at the data and have a good discussion among all of the economists and their different approaches, but certainly it has had an impact in some sectors. But is it the source of why we aren't creating more manufacturing jobs now? I would argue no. Even companies that are reshoring at this point are doing so with heavily automated plants that require much fewer workers. And the National Association of Manufacturers has estimated that there are going to probably be about 3 million new manufacturing jobs created in the United States over the next 10 years, and about 1 million of them are going to be jobs that can't be filled because there aren't workers who have the skill set. So as much as China is probably going to be a punchline in a variety of points that candidates make, I think that it is in our interests, and certainly in the interests of Secretary Kerry and Secretary Liu, to the extent that it comes up, to make sure that we put this relationship in context, that it is a mutually beneficial one with a lot of warts that we have to figure out how to address the problems that American companies are having in China, that we have on human rights issues, securities issues, climate change issues, whatever it might be. But that in general, we are all better off by more engagement and working through these issues, and our economy benefits from it, rather than thinking that there's an alternative.
Thank you. I'm David Lauder with Reuters News Service here in Washington. I had a question about the future of this dialogue. Erin, I think you mentioned that there needs to be value demonstrated to the next administration. Secretary Clinton's probably pretty invested in this since she created the S&ED format several years ago. But if Donald Trump wins, how worried are you that he will decide to either downgrade this very far or just drop it altogether?
I've got other concerns if Donald Trump is elected president, probably. Who knows what a Trump administration might do, and I think probably we're still too early to know. I think that the best hope that we have, for those of us at least on the commercial and economic side, is you have to demonstrate the value. If he is pragmatic and is looking at things that are effective and he's trying to keep in place, then presumably having had an 8 to 10 year track record, depending on how you want to count when the ampersand was added, it certainly makes the case that you need to continue it. But I think none of us seem to be totally wedded to this exact structure or to this name. It really is, the whole point of all of this is dialogue. And if there's better ways to do it, then I'm certainly open to the suggestions.
If I could just comment on how the Chinese are looking at Donald Trump, which may be somewhat relevant to this question, because there's really been some reporting suggesting that they really think Hillary Clinton would be better for them because she's more predictable. They know her, even though they think that she's tougher. But from my experience talking to people in China, there is a view that Trump would be very transactional as president, that this is the way he's a businessman, he understands how you make deals, and that that's something that is actually very appealing to China. The Chinese themselves are very transactional. So they're really of a sort of mixed mind. They have concerns about Clinton, they have concerns about Trump's potential unpredictability, but favor the fact that he might be transactional. So there might be various ways that if, as Trump, he saw that this is a useful way to get things done with China, that it would continue. But I agree with Erin, it's very premature. We don't even know who his advisors are or would be, so it seems very speculative at the moment.
Do you think any of the speculation on the Chinese side is potentially an upside for this S&ED, because it's at least a little bit more predictable than what might come
Last
afterwards?
chance for normality?
No? Okay. Yes, in the middle.
Thank you. I'm Macy McAlpin. I'm here at CSIS. My question is kind of for Joanna, but also for all of you. You've mentioned that the most of the progress that's been made recently has been in the areas of energy and environment, and that there's also likely to be a lot of conversations between technical experts and municipal officials at this round. Do you think that it's possible to leverage that progress and cooperation from that sector into some of the other rockier aspects of the relationship, or are the conversations too siloed?
I'm happy to start. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. We were actually talking about this amongst ourselves earlier. I mean, I think that it's important that we have this constructive relationship right now on climate, energy, environment, because it sort of keeps the conversation going in many ways. I mean, I think it brings the two countries together at the highest level. It shows that they're, even at times when we are, having very tough discussions on some of these security issues where we really don't see eye to eye and where our interests are far less well aligned, it reminds us that there still are places we can work very constructively together and not just bilaterally, but again, influence the global conversation and the multilateral agenda. So I think that having that, that constant reminder is important, and it, not only does it allow you to have actual outcomes that you can write about in the deliverables, but, we were actually talking about whether you see spillover if something kind of goes south in one of the other areas. Does that hurt the more constructive areas of the relationship? I haven't seen that as much, although maybe one exception would be there were some very high-profile clean energy-related trade disputes in solar and other areas over the last couple of years, and that was one area I think that bled a bit into the bilateral conversations. But maybe the others have thoughts on this as well.
I'll just jump in and add that I think it's incredibly important to show that there can be cooperation and progress on issues simply to substantiate that fact, right? To show that it is possible. But I think it happens most often when clearly defined interests align. And one of the great challenges for human rights issues at the moment is not that the administration isn't going to pick the right 3 individual cases to raise, or it's going to fail to talk about the NGO law. I think that it wants very much to make an interest-based argument to people who fundamentally do not share the premises, right? I mean, I'm not aware of anybody in the Chinese leadership, for example, who shares the premise of the US's argument that the country is more stable in regions like Tibet and Xinjiang by respecting rights. If there's somebody in the Politburo who believes that engaging those communities in a discussion about their grievances will lead to the kind of stability they say they want, I would really love to know who that is. And so I think absent some of those shared premises, you're not necessarily going to see the kind of progress that you see, for example, in climate change issues. I think the really tough next step on human rights issues is that the US has to do a much better job of articulating some consequences for failure to make certain kinds of progress or rolling back problematic laws or things like that. That there has to be a cost to a failure to progress. And it's very hard to generate a lot of enthusiasm for that.
Afternoon, I'm Bob Icord, now with the Atlantic Council. I was at the State Energy Resources Bureau for the last 4 years working on these issues. And having worked with a lot of commissions, clearly this one was, I think, very unique in terms of both the scale of the interactions as well as the level of attention, high level attention on both sides. And I think I agree with Joanna that, in a sense, a lot of the discussions and certainly Kerry's efforts to bring climate and energy together did provide an important focus leading up to Paris. And I remember last year when they brought the high-level delegation, you had Biden, Kerry, Liu, and Paulson all stressing the climate issue and how important it was, and then we need a carbon price, which may have influenced their decision to go ahead with a national emissions trading system, although that had been in works for a long time. I guess looking at the future, we did have a lot of discussions with regards to the market reform issues within DRC and NEA. Frankly, I was a little disappointed, though, that we didn't get farther on that issue because obviously there was interest expressed, and even including the grid company, in having that, and we had the interaction with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. But I think now it's particularly urgent that they deal with these issues, even though we had the important announcements last year. So I'm hoping that we can make some progress in terms of really trying to help them come out with a clear set of market rules and approaches. Because, I mean, Erin, as you were saying, I mean, China's right now facing an unprecedented overcapacity. And it's not just coal and steel. And frankly, I don't think that the numbers are quite accurate with regards to 6.9% GDP growth, especially if you have electricity growth of 0.5%. It's an awful big drop in energy intensity in 1 year. So I think that, you know, obviously you have that issue and the interaction between both the domestic and the global economic and political situation, how the government's going to take it. Are they going to try to, you know, to bail out these companies, or are they really going to move toward reform? And I think reform is going to be more difficult in that environment in terms of moving toward economic dispatch and rational prices when you've got that kind of overcapacity. And then the other aspect that you mentioned, and then last question. Okay. The other is the global implications. What are the global implications of this in terms of supporting increased exports? I mean, we've seen what's happened in steel. And so I think that issue of are they going to increase financing for exports is going to be an important issue.
Do either of you want to respond to that?
I can start on the energy side and maybe speak more broadly. I mean, I think that I think the leadership has made clear that power sector reform is high on the agenda, but I think it's going to be a sort of a slow, cautious transition, right? Because it basically is going to require dismantling some of the most powerful monopolies, state-owned monopolies in the country, right? And this is, though, of course, not the first time this has happened in China. I mean, China previously, over 10 years ago, did the same thing in the power sector when they separated the generation from distribution and created the current, Big Five and the grid companies. So I think now that you have all these policies that are requiring market incentives in the power sector, like the cap and trade program, like renewables, priority dispatch, and a variety of other policies, quota type systems, it's becoming increasingly clear how these things can't function very efficiently in a system where all the prices are controlled. And even now with the pilot cap and trade programs, I mean, essentially you can't pass through a carbon price in China, right? So I think even if the leadership sort of understands the efficiencies with a carbon price as opposed to a more command and control type regulation, if prices are fixed, you essentially have to do a price on the front end and on the back end, and it's just very inefficient, right? So I think there's a variety of sort of things all coming together right now, which are really, I think, emphasizing the importance of thinking through how you can change the structure of the power sector. But there's very powerful entities at play, and so I think it's going to be gradual. But I think the U.S. government, as well as sort of many big foundations, NGOs, and others who work in the space, are all very focused on that here and elsewhere.
I'll just say on the overcapacity issues, it clearly is tied up to what is a very robust internal debate that's going on in China about the direction of economic reforms. There appear to be people who have the ear of President Xi and who are in a position to be able to advance economic reforms, who recognize that you need to reform the state-owned enterprises, the energy sector, that you need to have industries creating profit and sustaining their own industry in a competitive market. There are good examples of how China has done that successfully. When China joined the World Trade Organization, they largely opened up their manufacturing sector. Here we are 15 years later. You cannot say that China is anything other than a world leader in manufacturing, if not the most dominant factor, and that is in part due to very robust competition from other manufacturing entities. There's been some very interesting research into what that economy looks like and how much is still tied up to state-owned enterprises and all, but the private sector, the services sector, where they want growth to come from and the types of jobs that they want to create still is largely closed off. And it probably is unrealistic to think that you can take anybody who has been mining coal and putting them into doing direct sales, but at the same time, there probably are competitive industries where a good worker retraining program could work. Steel workers probably do have the kind of skill sets that could translate into other sectors. How all of that works and how fast it goes is right now, well, the answer right now is it's not going very fast. But clearly the intent is still there. It's just a matter of how far they're able to go. In an ideal world from the business community's perspective, that is done in a way that includes genuinely opening up to competition to allow foreign companies to come in and do all of those things as well, create jobs, create wealth, provide innovative products into the market, because that has been proven to be a successful model. And so the best that we can do out of dialogues like the S&ED, I think, is to continue to push why not only overcapacity is a problem, but what the solutions are to get out of that kind of endless cycle that they're in.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Yes.
Hello, my name is Ben, and I think there's a consensus that in the strategic and economic dialogue, the human rights issue has been neglected or even ignored. So are the panelists concerned that if the U.S., the next administration were to integrate human rights issue as part of S&ED, are all the panelists concerned that this might actually adversely affect cooperation in other realms like energy, economics, or security? Thank you.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I understood the question correctly, that if human rights were to be added into the S&ED, would it have a negative consequence for the other issues?
Right.
I don't think so. My fellow panelists might disagree.
This gets at a larger more fundamental
But
question.
I think that absent a functioning independent legal system, the free flow of information, the ability of people to share their ideas without the fear of persecution, these are not only basic human rights, I think they're also essential dynamics that underpin making climate change agreements enforceable, that make it possible for contracts to be upheld, to have some more confidence or transparency around security issues. I mean, we have argued for a long time that human rights issues are not boutique ones that sit off on the back shelf by themselves, but in fact underpin a lot of the other issues and therefore deserve that kind of elevation and recognition. And I think it is very telling that for all of the drama around the 2012 S&ED, that not only did that get resolved, but it got resolved and there didn't seem to be any sort of deleterious effect for the other issues that were being discussed. And I think that's worth mentioning. But what do you guys think?
Yeah, and maybe we can broaden it a little bit because we were talking about this the other day. I mean, to the extent that that question touches on this other larger question of kind of the overall cost-benefit analysis involved in our government making decisions about when to sort of more forcefully talk about irritants within the relationship and to the degree to which that is going to have negative impacts on other areas of the relationship. How do we feel that that's worked out? I mean, it seems like, Joanna, at least in your area, the interests are aligned. They're going to kind of be aligned.
I think that's right, but I mean, I think as you were mentioning, there's the high level, and then there's sort of you keep going deeper and deeper, and it is a lot of this is based on trust and transparency, and a feeling that sort of both sides are following through, and so I think that this is one area where I think you've had a very constructive sort of high level relationship. I think it does trickle down to the sort of the working level, but there's still plenty of areas, right, where if you kind of go deep enough, there's still real concerns. I think we're still, I think many countries, China included, have a lot of work to do still on data transparency issues, on which I think would make everyone sort of feel more confident in general that the Paris Agreement was not just,
You think that's? I mean, is that an analysis that seems to you to be accurate, or could we afford to be more assertive, if that's the right word, than we have been maybe over the past few years?
I think it's a flawed logic that if the U.S. puts pressure on China on one particular issue, that it's going to undermine cooperation on another. The extent to which China is working with the U.S. on Iran or on North Korea is a function of China's interests. They're not doing it as a favor to the United States. And I don't believe that if we are trying to talk with the Chinese about human rights or other things that you might call irritants, that China will necessarily do less. Sometimes there are Chinese scholars that hint, if you just do some things, reduce the pressure on us in the South China Sea, we'll do more on North Korea. I really don't believe that. I don't think that makes sense. And if you look at the other side of that, when there are people in the administration here who say we cannot do something to irritate China because we want China's support on Iran or climate change. We're heading into Paris. We have to be careful what we do. I think that's unfortunate as well, because I don't think that the record bears out that China will do less or somehow punish the United States in one area because we're doing something else in an area that they don't like.
And yet, amazingly, you can see new governments coming into office all over the world go through that cycle again and again and again. You can sort of set your watch by it. But I actually just wanted to make one other different point about the S&ED. It is normal and rational and logical that governments talk to governments and that diplomats talk to diplomats. But the Chinese government is not the same thing as people across China. And I think if the US really is serious about being concerned about human rights issues, it has to bear in mind that its primary interlocutor on the other side of the table is setting an anti-human right, or is not enthusiastic about a human rights agenda, but it is no less important for the US to convey to the broader population the importance and the emphasis it puts on those issues. And so it has to go find ways, at the S&ED and in other settings, to go above and beyond, or as far as an officially agreed upon agenda allows, to convey to a broader audience that that's an issue that matters to the U.S.
Down to me,
Thoughts
huh?
from you?
Yeah, I guess I would just say on this point, I do think that we have a lot of discussion about how we should get tougher on China on various issues, but frankly, so much of the discussion, using the context of the S&ED, you have to have the right person on the other side of the table. Sophie, you're right. It may be that there is just a fundamental disagreement on some issues that we're never going to come to an agreement with, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to raise a significant number of issues with a vice premier who doesn't have in his control the ministries that you are concerned about. Wang Yang does not have NDRC report up to him. So we can have plenty of conversations about how some of these issues are going, but you also have to consider that you have to hit it on multiple fronts, because the people who can actually affect the kind of change you're looking for need to be at the table and not just told by a colleague, oh, by the way, the Americans told me that you need to be doing X, Y, and Z with your overcapacity.
I'm all for hitting it on all fronts.
All right, I think on that note, we can wrap it up, but I hope you'll join me in thanking Bonnie and our hosts. And the panelists.